Okay, speed.
Sound speeding. Action.
Hello and welcome back to Sequence Editor University. I'm your host, Professor Gibbons, and today I want to talk to you about a very important and I think kind of like overlooked topic in video editing and the digital video tools space, and that is compositing and blending in video editing. You see, I have a lot of different theories about what editing is, or maybe different anecdotes about what editing is, but one of them is that editing is the manipulation of time and light to convey ideas. And we talk a lot about the first thing, the manipulation of time. So in the early days of film, editing was not a creative aspect. There was no narrative storytelling conveyed using editing. And as such, motion pictures were very much just motion pictures, just moving images. But the mechanism of cutting gave us the ability to control and manipulate time in order to convey ideas. This is what we call montage theory. You know, one shot plus another shot equals a third meaning. And this gave us a new element of the cinematic language when it came to manipulating time. But what about the manipulation of light? What aspect of editing gave us the ability to manipulate light in a way that was different and contributed to the cinematic language? Well, I would argue that that's where compositing and blending features come in. So today I want to talk about like the basic idea of compositing and blending and some of the features that make it up. So we're going to talk through a couple of these different features, and I will show you some examples of things that you can do with them. So the most basic aspect of compositing and blending is just layering, putting one thing on top of another. One element sits above another element and creates this idea of depth. This is really important because the picture plane, the image on which you see a film or a movie, is a two-dimensional surface. There is no depth to it at all, so we have to create that depth in some way. And in order to do this, we do layering. So one of the most famous examples of this is Walt Disney's multiplane camera, which was a big contributor to the golden era of Disney animation, because a lot of animation at that time was just hand-painted on two-dimensional cells. And there were a lot of ways to fake depth, but you can only get so far when you are painting on a two-dimensional surface. So the multiplane camera actually split the elements of the animation, the foreground, the midground, and the background, onto different cells that they would split apart in space and then photograph with a camera. And this layering gave them the ability to create more realistic and more interesting animations.
Our same moonlight scene, the way the multiplane camera sees it. As you can see, we finally got the moon to keep its proper distance.
You can start to build off of layering with opacity, which is just controlling the amount of alpha of the entire image. So opacity is, I feel like I don't need to explain this. Opacity is something we're all very familiar with, but it's also kind of like the most basic form of blending two images together, because you don't really have control over what gets seen and what doesn't get seen, just overall how the two images mix together. Alpha channels. So once we start to build up a little bit more in technical complexity, we get introduced to the idea of alpha channels, right? So a video is typically RGB channels, red, green, and blue. Alpha channels is an additional fourth channel using black and white pixels that tells you how much opacity or transparency exists in a given pixel. In compositing software like After Effects and Nuke and Maya and all this stuff, there's this ability to create your video layer, have another alpha layer sitting next to it, and then do interesting things with these two things together. In some cases, they can be packaged together. So this is where we get the advantage of like being able to support ProRes 4444 with alpha in sequence, is that essentially a ProRes 4444 alpha clip is an RGB video clip that has that additional alpha channel information baked into the video clip, so that when it's decoded, we automatically know which pixels are supposed to be transparent. This is good as kind of like a fallback for compositing, but it's also difficult because it's a very, very, very uncommon file type. Unless you work in VFX and compositing, or you have software and kind of like know what you're doing about how to create this, most people do not have alpha channel video. So it's kind of a last resort. And then there's my favorite, blending modes. Blending modes are a bunch of algorithms, a bunch of math that basically determines how pixels and overlapping layers interact. So if opacity is just a pure mixing of two values, blending modes lets you start to do really interesting ways with the way these things interact with each other. So blending modes are very common in basically every design, photo, and video tool that you have access to, but they're also kind of like a playful thing, something that you don't always know how to apply, but if you just play with a bunch of different options, you'll eventually get it right. And it also allows you to create a lot of interesting effects. Cropping, masking, and mats. These are all different things, but also I'm kind of just putting them together because these are sort of like, this is like towards the more advanced end where you're kind of getting out of video editing and into definitely like visual effects. Maybe not cropping, but cropping is kind of like your most basic ability to just take a percentage of pixels off of the left, right, top, and bottom of a clip. And then you also get into the idea of masking and mats, which is that if cropping is just taking a specific amount off the edges in the top, masking and mats are defining a very specific shape of where you want to show content through versus not show content through. This was done originally by just painting on top of a glass plate, and whatever was not painted and showed through the glass to the camera, well, that was your matte. That was your live action image shining through the matte. Today we do this more with shape tools, like graphic tools that draw essentially a luma matte, and then the software will use that luma matte in the background to kind of mask or crop the image. Building off of this idea, you've got rotoscoping, which has a lot of different applications, both within editing and animation. If we're talking about kind of like the multiplane camera from the Walt Disney days, another secret to Walt Disney's animation was that they used rotoscoping to figure out the expressions and animations of their characters. So rotoscoping is essentially the idea of drawing a mask or a matte frame by frame and interpolating those values to kind of play over the footage. One of the most famous examples of this is the music video Take On Me, where they get the cool little like sketchy effect. That's not that they just sketched that from scratch. It was video footage that you then draw reference frames over. There's a tool that has been popular over the last year called Wonder Studio, which is a really cool AI VFX tool that will automatically segment and track the characters from the video and kind of rotoscope a new character over them. And then luma mats. So, we've kind of skated around this by talking about alpha channels and talking about mats and masking. And that's where you get the idea of luma mats, which is essentially like if you take that alpha channel video and render it out into a pure black and white image, that is a luma matte or a luma mask video. You can then use that in software to do interesting things with that luma information. And then, of course, there's good old chroma keying, one of the most foundational forms of compositing in visual effects. Chroma keying works by essentially taking one very prominent, easy to recognize color and saying that's the color that we want to make transparent. I feel like this is, I don't need to explain it. We all know chroma keying. We all know green screening. We love it. We need it. And then finally, there's this sort of like new option, which is again just like a combination of many of these options together, but I'm going to just like put it as its own term to talk about it, and that's segmentation. In order to create a lot of these different masks or mats or options for compositing, you have to kind of know how to cut out a subject. You have to know which method might be the best one to cut out a subject, and then you need to know the best method for how to preserve that information and how to composite it onto other video. Segmentation is interesting because it's the idea of machine learning guided rotoscoping and masking. Like, what if instead of trying to define a subject and rotoscope over it like you do with After Effects' RotoBrush, what if by the time you click on an image, we have already identified all the subjects and let you just cut them out? So this would be more like kind of like Apple's iPhoto thing, where you can just kind of like long press on a subject now and it cuts the subject out of the scene. Using models like Meta's Segment Anything Model 2, you now get AI-driven segmentation on video, which I think looks really interesting. If instead of putting multiple compositing tools together and allowing you to create that mask yourself and create a way to save that mask, like what if you could kind of just like enter this segmentation mode and click on anything in the image and cut it out? And I think that would be really cool. So what are couple things you might want to do with some of these blending and compositing workflows. You might want to create a picture-in-picture effect, one of the most classic effects, just showing video over other video. We got a Mr. Twitch streamer here who's making a little gaming video and needs to do some picture-in-picture gameplay stuff. So basically we're just going to put the stream on V1 and the A-roll on V2. We can go ahead and scale down this video and reposition it to somewhere that we like. Now, this video was shot 16:9, and so maybe that's just, you know, taking up more space than we'd really like it to. So we can go over to Effects and find our crop effect. Throw that on here. And now we have the ability to take this in a different amount. So let's say we're going to take this in 20% on the left and right side, and then go ahead and reposition it where we want.
As white, blocking off the foreground
And we
lights
got
and
a
replacing it with a
picture-in-picture
much
effect.
cleaner key. This is a very straight.
You might want to create split screens to show multiple elements on screen at the same time, but be able to control the exact timing and layout of those elements as they're shown on screen at the same time. In modern NLEs, you're going to be able to create split screens either completely from scratch within the app, because you can kind of like draw graphics, or they'll have like motion graphics templates where you can just kind of slot in the videos. Another option that you might see is that certain stock providers like Motion Array will provide split screen overlays like this one. So this is kind of like a matte overlay that's supposed to provide a little like filmic type look. And so for something like this, you're going to want to cut out the white part, which you could just do with, no, not lighten, with darken. Cool. So now we've got our split screen frame on top and 3 clips below it. So for this first clip, we're going to want to go ahead and crop it again on the left-hand side. And then we could go ahead and also reposition it. You know, maybe this one should be over here. We got to crop a little bit off the right-hand side. Perfect. And now let's make this one sit over here, which means we're going to have to throw a crop effect on the left-hand side to reveal the third clip. Wow, beautiful split screen. You might have VFX and motion graphics, which you have to add into your video footage using multiple passes, using multiple workflows, using multiple features in order to get it to feel as cohesive as possible. You might want to put some aesthetics onto your videos, some overlays, some stylization to make it feel like it's part of a world, to make it feel like it has some grit and some texture. This is a gorgeous clip, but I think that we can make it oomphier, you know? So sometimes you might see these sorts of like mats to put over clips where they just kind of like add a nice little filmic look. So we're going to take a darken effect. Overlay? Oh, overlay's not bad. Darken is cleaner though. And then we're going to turn on another layer. We've got these sort of like little CRT film frame overlays. Let's go ahead and throw lighten on those. Yeah. And then, of course, the most important aesthetic element of all. Grain. I like using soft light for my grain. And then maybe dropping the opacity like 75%. Beautiful. Shitposting, memes, you know, if you want to be funny, you gotta be able to rotoscope and chroma key random shit into your video. Double exposure effects, you know, if you're making a cool kind of mystery thriller cop title sequence, you gotta have the double exposure effect. Atmospheric and VFX assets, you know, there was this really popular thing when I was growing up called action VFX, and I remember spending like 3 days trying to pirate this like 80 gigabyte file of action VFX, but these are essentially just kind of like fire and gunshot and smoke and debris assets that you need to like add on to your footage in order to make it more realistic, especially if you're dealing with like action stuff. Mr. Finger Guns here, if you wanted to actually, like we can't afford guns with blanks if we were to shoot a short film, right? We would be using airsoft guns and muzzle flashes like this. So again, this is very, very simple to do. You basically have these little like muzzle flash elements or kind of like fog and hits, and you basically just, drop that on there. Play around with the blending mode. And bang. There's some really cool video analysis that you can do with some of these techniques. There's this phenomenal video from Posey called Motion Extraction, where he uses blending modes in order to kind of analyze the differences of clips over time. And I think it's just absolutely stunning. Working with green screens, blue screens, you need chroma keying. I really like Final Cut Pro for this. So you got footage. It's got a green background or a blue background, or technically it could have any color at all. You can use this to take out any color, but most conventionally we use it to take out a green background. So I'll come to the effects, chroma, green screen here, boop, wow, and yeah, it's just done because we chose green. That is a wrap. Again, this is just scratching the surface. As you can tell, there's a lot of different elements and workflows that fall into compositing and blending, but there's also a lot of powerful stuff you can do once you start to understand these workflows. And so yeah, I'm excited to see how these play out in sequence.